My name is João Cabrita. So I've been around the Geek Sessions for quite a bit. And today I'm going to talk about, I've called it RoguEST. It's basically, I'm going to do a comparison of different API design styles. And by different, I mean two different API design styles. And okay, so why RoguEST? So RoguEST comes from REST, obviously, and it comes from the name Rogue. So who here is familiar with the game, Rogue the game? Okay, I'm showing my age maybe. So Rogue,
we are.
yeah. So Rogue is a very old game. It's a command line, text-based game, and it's very, very simple. So and for the purposes of my demo or talk, I'm going to focus on three features. So basically, you have scenes. So basically, you have, for example, you have a map where there are several rooms. So each room is a scene or is a room. And then you have objects which you can interact with. And then you have enemies, which you can fight. You can attack them, and they attack you back. And basically, the game, you navigate around, you interact with objects, and you fight with enemies. And the game basically just never ends until you either get killed or get bored. That's basically it. And it's turn-based, so it's sort of like you do one action, like navigating, interacting with an object, and that consumes a turn, and then things happen around the world, and then you do something else, and then the world keeps updating like that. So the first design style that I'm going to talk about is OpenAPI. So for those who might not be familiar with the name OpenAPI, it used to be called Swagger, and it's a very well-known standard, or at least it should be. And I've called it OpenAPI precisely because it's the usual style of design that you follow when you're writing an OpenAPI spec, okay? So let's see here. So let's start with just getting the current state of the game. So we just started the game, okay? Let's all jump ahead to that point, and let's just assume that we started the game and we want to know where we are at, okay? So we make this request, get/scene, okay? Everyone here familiar with HTTP, right? Okay, cool. And if you're not, you can leave now. It's going to save you a lot of time, okay? I probably should have said that a bit earlier. And Jason, everyone here is also familiar with Jason, right? Yeah. Okay, so I think this is a pretty simple request and response, I think. So get/scene, you get a JSON object with this description property, which contains text, right? Text-based game, right? So you get, I'm sorry for the poor writing skills. I mean, that's why I went into software. So, like I said, so we're going to start with navigating around the map. So we have a map, we have rooms in the map, right? And we have to navigate around them. So I'm going to add this directions property to my payload, right? This is for demonstration purposes, okay? This is not meant to be a production-ready API. It's just meant to be easy, right? Because if I put IDs like numbers, it's going to be a bit harder to follow. So, okay. So in this room, there are two directions that we can go, that we can navigate to. So there's north and there's east, right? And how do we navigate? So first of all, we can inspect the directions, right? So we can do get/directions/north, or whatever the ID is, and we get another JSON payload with a description, right? And so if the point here of the payload is that it has the description property. So if you're writing a front-end application, right, you can just take the description, format it nicely for the user, and display it. So you can inspect the direction, and it gives you some more information about that. Okay. To navigate, you do, surprise, surprise, you do post/directions/north, or whatever the ID is. And what you get back is a new scene. Okay? So you get some more text with some more poorly written text, and you get, for example, another set of directions. So the scene changed, and now you can either go north or you can go south, right? Which, I mean, south makes sense because you came in, you went north, right? So you can go back unless a door closes or something like that. Okay. Everything clear so far? Nothing mind-blowing, right? Okay. Pretty trivial. I would actually say that this is pretty trivial. Okay, so now, second feature. Now we have the MVP. We can navigate all we want. That's really boring. So let's add objects. So to do that, I add this new property here, which is called imaginatively objects. And I follow the same pattern, right? So it's an array of the stuff that I can interact with in the scene, and it has the IDs, or this can be, like I said, it can be an object that has a name and has the ID. Okay. And it has the exact same two actions. You can inspect it, which gives it some more text, right? It gives you a bit more description about it so that you have a sort of clue of what will happen if you interact with it. And you can do a post to /objects/ID to interact with the object, right? So here I don't know if you've been following the text. So it was a campfire, and when you interact with it, when you inspected it, you saw that there were some torches. So when you interact with it, you pick up a torch and you light it up, and you see better. That's it, right? Okay, so then you add, so then you navigate again, and now we're going to work on the third feature, which is adding enemies. So again, nothing new here. We add a property called enemies, and it has an array of the enemies that are in the current scene. Okay. Follows exactly the same structure. And how do we interact with enemies? Same pattern. Get /enemies/enemy ID, and you get a description of the enemy, or you can attack it using a post to the exact same URL, right? And in this case, this is the end of the game. You get stabbed by a spear and die. So to summarize, when you're designing an open API, using the open API design style, basically what happens is that you have these objects that compose your API, and each of those objects is associated with a certain endpoint, right? Or a certain endpoint pattern, right? So you have directions, and directions to interact, to do things with directions, you use /directions/direction ID. You replace the direction ID here. With objects, exactly the same thing. With enemies, the exact same thing, okay? Makes sense so far, right? Okay. So now I'm going to move on to what I call the REST design style. And this is me just being a bit pedantic, because OpenAPI isn't, like, if you look at the actual constraints that REST imposes, OpenAPI is not REST, does not follow REST. It's sort of, but I mean, the industry just caught on to the term, so I'm just, yeah. It's not like our industry has a habit of taking terms and just running with them, right? So, and for this, the main concern, and what distinguishes this approach from the previous approach, is that we're going to introduce a new concept. And the concept is links, right? So we're going to have each of the resources or the endpoints in our API are going to have links to the other stuff that is in our API, Okay, so in this case, for example, this is a link to the self resource. So it's basically saying, hey, this is where I am at, and this is my title, right? Which you can use, for example, you could use for bookmarking reasons, right? You access a resource, and then it gives you a link because you might have been redirected from somewhere else, and you don't know exactly what that is, or the resource URI might have been aliased or whatever. You just get this ref here, okay? So let's design the API again. Okay, so we start from the same place. So we have our scene, we do get/scene, and we get the exact same JSON payload, right? And now we're going to add the navigation options. And we're going to do so using links, okay? And you'll notice that one of the differences here is that the link is already built here. The API has already built the full URI that the client needs to follow, right? You don't have to take the ID and put it into the pattern. That work has been done for you. I've also added some titles just so to make it nice, but it's easy to see that you could have also done that with the previous style, right? Okay, so this is going to be a bit faster because, I mean, I've already talked about what you can do. And so just inspecting stuff is just going to be exactly the same thing. It's just taking the whatever URI is here and doing a GET request to that, right? And so this, for navigation, this is going to be exactly the same thing. So you do post to /direction/north. The only difference here is that you take the URI that the API gives you and you interact with that, okay? Right? So clear? It's clear so far? Okay. Now we're going to add objects to interact, right? And objects are going to be links as well, right? If you look at this, it's going to be exactly the same. It's not going to be any different from the other navigation links, right? Which is kind of different from what we had before. So let's see how this plays out. So, okay, so you have the URI there, and you can also do the exact same thing that we did with the navigation. We take the URI, and we make a post request, right? And that allows us to use objects. So now let's add enemies, and that is right. We're going to add enemies as links. And the URI is here, and so if I want to attack an enemy, I do exactly, I'm going to do exactly the same thing, which is why I haven't included a slide for it. Okay. So to summarize, remember that I said that when we designed the API using the OpenAPI design style, we had 3 different endpoints, right? And with the client, you had to, like, depending on whether it's an object, you have to go to /object/ID. If it's an enemy, you have to go to /enemies/ID, right? And what I'm trying to focus on here is that there's really no difference, is it? Is there any difference? Can anyone think of, right? It's exactly the same, isn't it? Right?
More straightforward. It indicates a reference of links. The client just has to worry about links.
Right. That's exactly it. The only thing that the client needs to know is that the JSON responses have a description property, and they take that and show it to the user. And then all that they have to do is to list out all of the links there, okay, and give the user 2 options, either inspect or use, right? It's like dead simple, right? It's like, it's a mouse, and you have 2 buttons, right? It's inspect. You don't need to know whether that's an enemy or whatever, right? Because the front end doesn't need to do that. I mean, you could add some bells and whistles, right? But you don't have to. That's the main point here, is that you don't have to, right? In fact, if you look at the JSON response and the way that we're interacting with it, you'll find that it's very, very similar to HTML, right? In HTML, to inspect stuff, I would add a link, and I just click it, and it gives me some text back, right? And if I want to interact with it, so if I want to navigate, I can just click the button. It submits the form, changes the server state, right? And it works. And because I've added the titles, for example, right? The front end doesn't need to know, like the front end doesn't need to know what the actions are, right? If it's an enemy, I just tell it, okay, this action, when you display this to the user, just say that the action is attack enemy, right?
Do you have a title for get and post?
Sorry?
Do you have a title for get and for the get request and another title for the post request?
Yeah, so for example here, I have the
But
link.
does the API give you that title?
The API can do whatever you want, right?
I think what he's saying, can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Here, you know there's a troll, but you don't really know that the troll is an enemy and what you can do with it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. The thing here is that anything that you can do here, you can also do here, right?
I can say title get and title post. Okay.
You could call it. You could have called it interaction and inspection.
You want to do post or you want to do get with this one. So
Exactly. I mean, I have very limited space here, so I mean, so that's why. Yeah. So basically, that's it, right? So the websites that we interact with every day, they're built on the RESTful API, on the RESTful design style. In fact, the REST design style, so REST was defined in the PhD dissertation by Roy Fielding, right? And he basically formalized that design style based on the architecture of the internet, right? So he didn't invent it. He he invented it in the same way that Newton invented the law of gravity, which means that he didn't. He just discovered that there was a law of gravity, right? And yeah, I think that's pretty much all there is, right? And so the last thing that I would have like to say is that, so why would you design an API like this, right? And as I've hinted throughout the presentation, the benefit here is that the client is much, much simpler. I hope that I've been able to convince you of that, right? Because the client just needs to know links, some a bit of the payload structure, right? And that's basically it. Obviously, I chose a cherry-picked example in which linking works really great. But from my experience, so I've been building these kinds of APIs for, I don't know, maybe over 6 years now, right? And I keep discovering new ways in which you can use this to make client implementation much, much easier, right? Because right now what you have is that you have basically two separate systems which are incredibly complex, right? And you want to, I mean, obviously you can't take out the business logic, right? So you need to have some server side or whatever, right? But ideally you would like to have the front end as clean as possible. And yeah, that's basically it. Just to finish on a final note, like imagine how crazy the internet would be if, for example, you log onto your computer, right? You go to, I don't know, Facebook, right? And when you go to Facebook, Facebook gives you an open API spec. And it says, if you want to get your friends list, get your user ID, and do a GET request to /friends list, users slash your ID slash friends list, right? Does that look like a nice user experience to you? It's not, isn't it? Right? So why are we doing that with our APIs? Why do we write APIs that require our clients to go around, okay, so now I have to pick this thing over here, and then I have to take it over here, and then I have to do it here, and then I have to hit it with the hammer, right? Right? It just adds all of this complexity. So to summarize, I hope I have convinced you to at least try this. I'm not going to pretend that this works for everything, right? Because it doesn't. There are very few things in software that do. But I mean, show of hands, who here works on web apps? Okay, it took you a bit of time, but okay. It took you a bit of time, right? So this is relevant for web apps, right? And most web apps, you consume some kind of API, right? And if you try just a little bit, I mean, this also isn't a lot of effort, right? And you might start to see some benefits. So do try it out, see what you think of it, and yeah, if you have any questions, just fire away, and I'll be here for a little bit later.
I have a question, sorry. So imagine I'm not sure if I'm loud. Maybe I'm loud. Okay. To add a layer of complexity, imagine I have to validate my previous state on this API. And how would it keep it simple, like in a REST? So imagine that, so I'm a client, and some options are given to me, but I need to say, hi, it's the client from before. I had this state, and I need to go left. So,
okay. So
how, what layers of complexity would it create in an open API style and in a REST style?
So the question here is basically how does state, so if you have different clients and each of those clients is associated with a different state, right? How does the API handle that?
How can it keep it clean, and how would it demonstrate itself in, like, how would it give in forms of links, for example? You would have to add something like, in this case, taking the rogue game, I would have to say, I am this character. And this character wants to fight the troll.
So I think if I understand,
okay.
If the backend is generating the URLs,
okay.
How do you translate state keep state in that conversation?
Okay, right, okay. So the short answer is that you don't have to, right? In that situation, for example, I wouldn't probably, because that works exactly like credentials, right? Because what you're saying is that you have, I don't know, a cookie or a session, or right? And that gets associated with the...
So it's just an extra functionality that doesn't really fit the...
So REST doesn't necessarily, you don't have to necessarily move that into the navigation, right? So what the server does is it tells you what you can do, right? But it can do that with some state that you might have access to or you might not have access to, right? So for example, if you have a session cookie or whatever, the server can go, like you do some interaction, right? And the server pulls up, okay, so it's this guy, let me see what game he's playing, what map I've generated for him, right? Because the server also has to, for example, if you're attacking the troll, the user still has to make sure that the troll is in the game, right? Because otherwise you can just go around. It tells you to go, you can either go north or south, and you tamper with the params, and you tell it to go east, right? That wouldn't go too well. So the server always, you would also have to do that with an open API style, right? So nothing of that changes. It's really just the way that you expose the state transfers, okay? Okay. Any more questions? Okay.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you for the talk. I'm curious, like you said that you cherry-picked that example because it's quite simple to actually show the links and navigations, and it's based on two verbs like the get and post. How do you use this with params? Like if you have a form where you have to provide some user input, will the links also tell you which param needs to be rendered for the user to interact with it? Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah. Okay. So that's relatively hard, and the reason that I didn't put that as an example here is because that would like blow up the presentation to like an hour or so, right? I can keep talking about this however long you want me to.
Just the TLDR.
Yeah. So that's a bit harder, but it's a very good point because you can decouple the client from the server quite a bit, but obviously there are some things that you just can't decouple. At some point, the client needs to know, right, what does this payload look like? So for example here, right, the client still needs to know that the payload looks like this. And if the client
title and an href.
Exactly. And if you have to send in requests, you also have to know like the payload of those requests, right?
Okay, so in that case, when you go to North, for example, and you follow that link, there's actually client code that knows that going north actually needs a couple of inputs. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. So for example, one of the things that, this is based on the HAL, Hypermedia Application Language, I think. It's a standard which builds on top of JSON and adds links, and it gives it certain semantics, right? And so for example here, when you have a link, you also have an additional property that you can define, which I think is profile, okay? And profile is basically a second layer of semantics that's added on top of the link. And basically it tells you, like if you follow this, the thing that's at the end of this link has this type, right? And then you can tell and then the application can say, you can program the front-end application to say, these are the types of things that I understand, right? So you can tell it, for example, if you're programming with React, I usually, like when I trying to think of how the client would work, I usually think in terms of React, which is, so you would have a component for navigation, for scenes basically, right? So when you add the profile here and you say that the profile is navigation, okay? You can take that and you can look up the component to render that, right? And then your front-end application is reduced to just routing between those, right? Because you still put them all in the links, and the client still only needs to know that it needs to do a get or a post, right? But then it has that routing just for doing the different rendering, to render the entities differently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I was just like thinking that it sounds kind of a leaky abstraction in the sense that you're actually relying on the API response to actually have some client-side, what do I say this, responsibility in the sense that you're kind of mixing it, the business logic of the application with whatever is the options that the UI will show you, right? So you can go north and east, but not south. And you're basically making differences on the front end based on that response. But that actually happens with all.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, at least in my experience, the problem with most of the front-end applications, or at least with most client-server applications that have a front-end and a back-end, is that you end up with duplicated code, on the front end and on the back end, right? Because you have to know that a user has a friend list. And then you have to do, or you have like a user has a best friend, right? And that's one person, right? But then you decide, oh, no, wait, but what if they grew up together and now you have several, right? And you've baked that in to the front end, right? And now you no longer have the ability to, you have to change the front end and you have to change the back end, right? Whereas if you have links, I mean, it's also not trivial. It depends on how much flexibility you built in, but you have an escape hatch. And also, actually, something very interesting is that if I have like /enemy/scroll here, for example, or /direction/north, right? And I don't know if this has ever happened to any of you, but at some point you need to change IDs for the entity because you've changed the data store and the data store generates IDs differently or whatever, right? So, or you need a different URI structure, right? If you generate the links, the client still works. You don't have to do any change on the client side, right? Because you just change the links, right? The server gives you different links. The client goes to the different links, and it just works. So I mean, it's not going to like save the world or anything, right? But I mean, if it makes the front end work 10% easier, I think.
It follows what it's given. Have you given something, it follows what it's.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not going to be 10% harder to do on the back end. So that's basically what I'm saying.